welcome to my channel. Today's story is a journey of secrets, transformation, and a side of myself. I was the kind of child adults described as quiet and thoughtful, which was their gentle way of saying I watched myself too closely. I learned early how to anticipate what people expected from me and how to behave in ways that earned approval. It wasn't exactly fear, at least not at first. It was a constant calculation. If I act like this, I belong. If I say that, I'm safe. Looking back, I can see how that habit became the frame around everything I did, including the parts of me I didn't have words for yet. One of my earliest memories is of standing in the hallway outside my mother's bedroom, holding my breath because I didn't know if I was allowed to be curious. The door was half open, and I could see the edge of her closet. It was nothing dramatic. Just dresses, blouses, soft sweaters, things that hung differently than my shirts. I remember being mesmerized by the textures more than the idea of women's clothing. The fabrics looked like they belonged to a world where your body could be held gently instead of squared off. When I was very young, I didn't think in categories like masculine or feminine. I thought in sensations: rough, smooth, heavy, light, safe, exposed, contained, floating. My mother was practical and tired, like a lot of parents. She wasn't unkind, but she didn't have extra energy for mysteries. My father, on the other hand, carried his own strictness like a tool belt. He believed in building a boy into a man the way you build a fence: measure twice, cut once, keep it straight, don't get sentimental about the materials. The rules weren't always spoken, but they were everywhere. Boys don't cry. Boys don't fuss. Boys don't ask for softness. Boys don't do anything that could be mistaken for weakness. When a child grows up in a house like that, he learns the difference between privacy and secrecy without anyone ever teaching him. Privacy is a healthy boundary. Secrecy is a hiding place you build because you're convinced the truth would make you unlovable. I didn't wake up one day and decide to build secrecy into my personality. I just started storing little pieces of myself in places no one could see, like a squirrel hiding food before winter. The first time I tried on anything that didn't belong to me, it wasn't because I was trying to shock myself or break a rule for the thrill of it. It was because curiosity can be as simple as gravity. I was alone at home, still young enough to be more clumsy than sneaky. I found something soft, an old cardigan, the kind my mother wore around the house. I slipped it on and stood in front of the mirror. I didn't suddenly become someone else. I didn't feel possessed, or transformed, or anything theatrical. I just felt quieter inside. Like a loud appliance had been switched off in my head. Then I heard the garage door and panicked so hard I almost tripped. I tore it off and shoved it back where I'd found it. My heart hammered as if I'd narrowly escaped a crime. I remember thinking, with the clear logic of a child, I didn't steal anything, I didn't hurt anyone, so why do I feel like I did something wrong? That question would follow me for decades, even when I got older and learned how to wrap it in more sophisticated language. In elementary school, I learned what made boys laugh and what made them go quiet in a dangerous way. I watched which kids got called names and which kids got left alone. I learned that masculinity wasn't just an identity, it was a test you could fail in front of an audience. And I learned something else too, that even when people didn't have proof, they could smell uncertainty on you. If you weren't solid in yourself, someone would try to push you over just to see what happened. So I became solid. Or I tried to. I did the things boys did. I made my voice a little lower. I stood with my shoulders wider. I laughed at jokes that didn't feel funny. I played sports with enough effort to seem invested, even though my mind often drifted away to places I couldn't explain. I wasn't miserable all the time. I had friends. I had real laughter. I had ordinary childhood moments that were genuinely good. That's important to say, because people sometimes assume that anyone who grows up exploring gender expression must have been suffering constantly. The truth is usually more complicated. You can have a basically decent life and still feel like you're performing it. At night, though, when the house was dark and the pressure to be watched disappeared, I would replay my day like a security camera and look for anything that might have betrayed me. Not betrayed in the sense of revealing a crime, but betrayed in the sense of revealing softness. I didn't know what I was afraid of exactly. I just had a deep conviction that certain kinds of honesty were dangerous. By the time I reached adolescence, the world around me started sorting everything into sharper categories. Bodies changed. Locker rooms became a place where you could be judged without words. Conversations among boys became more brutal, more obsessed with proving something. I felt like I was standing on a stage that got brighter every year, and the role I had to play got narrower. It was around that time that I started having what I can only describe as two parallel lives inside my head. In one life, I was the version of myself that could survive in daylight, the boy who could do what was expected, who could talk about the right things, who could pretend not to care too much. In the other life, I carried an unnamed longing to let myself be different, not as a rebellion but as a rest. I didn't have any clear plan for it. I didn't picture a dramatic coming out scene or a new identity with a neat label. I just knew there was a part of me that wanted permission to exist. I tried to bargain with myself the way anxious people do. I told myself it was a phase. I told myself it was just curiosity. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself that if I ignored it, it would fade, and I could keep living as a normal person. But ignoring something doesn't erase it, it just teaches it to live underground. And when something lives underground, it doesn't necessarily get weaker. Sometimes it becomes more confusing, because you stop relating to it with honesty and start relating to it with fear. In high school I did what many people do when they're trying to outrun the parts of themselves that feel complicated. I focused on achievement. Grades. Responsibilities. Being dependable. Being the kid teachers trusted. I built an identity out of competence, because competence is socially rewarded and emotionally safer than vulnerability. If I could be useful, maybe I could also be forgiven for whatever I was secretly carrying. But the private moments didn't disappear. They got rarer, because privacy was harder to find. And because I started punishing myself for wanting them at all. There were nights when I would lie awake and think, what is wrong with me? Am I broken? Am I disrespecting women? Am I making a mockery of something? The questions weren't fair, but they felt moral. When you grow up in a culture that treats gender as a strict border, crossing that border can feel like a kind of theft, even when you're only crossing it in your own room. I want to be careful with how I describe the next part, because I've seen how easily this topic gets turned into spectacle. For me, it was not about chasing a thrill. It was about trying to understand why my nervous system calmed down when I allowed myself to step out of the role I had been assigned. When I tried on certain clothes, when I allowed myself to move differently, when I let my face look softer in the mirror, I wasn't chasing an intense rush. I was searching for a sense of coherence. It felt like I could finally stop holding my breath. And that was the first real tension. How could something feel soothing and also feel forbidden? How could it make me feel more like myself and also make me feel ashamed? The internet arrived like a secret library. I found, slowly and cautiously, other people talking about gender expression in ways I'd never heard in my town. I learned words like crossdressing, and gender nonconforming, and transgender, and I felt both comforted and overwhelmed. Comforted because I wasn't alone, overwhelmed because I didn't know where I fit. I didn't feel like I was a woman trapped in a man's body, not in the clear, consistent way some people describe it. I also didn't feel like it was a joke or a costume. I felt like I had a layered self, and the layers didn't always match what people assumed. So I kept it private. Not because I believed privacy was the best choice, but because secrecy had become my default setting. The older I got, the more I understood that secrecy has a cost. It makes you vigilant. It makes you lie by omission. It makes you treat your own inner life like contraband. And it makes intimacy difficult, because intimacy requires truth, and truth requires risk. When I left for college, I thought I would finally become a different person, the way young people often believe geography can fix what psychology can't. I imagined I would arrive on campus and the old rules would dissolve. In some ways they did. There were more kinds of people. More ideas. More room to be strange without immediately being punished. But my fear didn't vanish. It traveled with me, packed neatly in my chest. College was the first time I had genuine freedom and also the first time I realized freedom is not the same as permission. You can be free to do something and still feel like you're not allowed. That's what internalized shame does. It turns your own mind into a gatekeeper. I made friends. I had late-night conversations about politics, art, religion, identity. I listened more than I spoke when the topic drifted toward gender. I would nod along and feel my stomach tighten, because part of me wanted to say, I think I understand more than you realize, but I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want the room's attention to land on me and start asking questions I couldn't answer. The first time I told someone a version of the truth, it happened almost by accident. It was a close friend, the kind of person who could sit in silence without making it awkward. We were talking about anxiety, about how hard it was to be a person who felt too much. I don't remember exactly how it came up, only that I heard myself say something like, sometimes I don't feel like I fit in my own skin. They asked what I meant, gently. I hesitated so long they could have changed the subject, but they didn't. They waited. So I told them, in clumsy fragments, that sometimes I wore clothes that weren't typical for a guy, and that it made me feel calm, and that I didn't know what it meant. I expected them to laugh or recoil or make it into a joke, because that was what I trained myself to anticipate. Instead, they looked at me with something like respect, which shocked me more than rejection would have. They asked, does it hurt anyone? I said no. They asked, does it help you feel more like yourself? I said yes, quietly. And they said, then maybe it's not something you have to be punished for. That sentence didn't solve my life, but it planted a seed. It was the first time someone outside my own head suggested that my internal experience might deserve kindness. Even with that, I didn't suddenly become confident. If anything, it made the stakes feel higher. If it could be okay, then what was I doing hiding? And if I stopped hiding, what would it cost? I had grown up believing that love was conditional on being understandable. If people couldn't categorize you quickly, they might decide you were unsafe. I didn't want to lose family, future jobs, relationships. I didn't want to become an issue. So I lived in careful compartments. I learned how to be two people without anyone noticing. I became highly skilled at switching contexts, at being one version of myself in public and another version in private. That skill looks like maturity from the outside. It looks like self-control. But inside, it can feel like fragmentation. It can feel like you're constantly monitoring which parts of you are allowed to breathe. After college I started working, and the adult world brought a new kind of pressure, responsibility. Bills. Schedules. Performance reviews. The subtle corporate demand to be professional, which often means predictable. I wanted stability. I wanted to be reliable. And I wanted, more than I admitted, to be seen as good. I dated. Sometimes I thought romance would fix me, that being desired in a conventional way would quiet the unconventional parts. That's an unfair expectation to put on another person, and it doesn't work anyway. The more I tried to use relationships as proof that I was normal, the more hollow I felt. I could be affectionate. I could be attentive. I could be present. But there was always a small part of me watching from behind glass, thinking, if you really knew me, would you still hold my hand? Eventually, I met someone who felt like a real turning point, not because they saved me, but because they invited honesty. They were the kind of person who didn't treat vulnerability as a burden. We talked about mental health. About family baggage. About the versions of ourselves we were taught to be. I didn't tell them everything right away. I tried, at first, to keep my compartments intact. But intimacy kept asking for more truth than I wanted to give. The first time I tried to explain my crossdressing to a partner, I did it badly. I framed it like a confession of wrongdoing. I over-apologized. I talked too fast. I tried to control their reaction by making myself small. I said things like, it's not a big deal, while clearly acting like it was. That's what shame does, it makes you unreliable as a narrator of your own experience. They listened. They asked questions. They didn't treat it as a joke, and they also didn't romanticize it. They wanted to understand what it meant to me emotionally. That was hard to answer, because for years I had treated the meaning as something dangerous, something I shouldn't examine too closely. I told them, honestly, that it helped me feel calm and whole, that it felt like emotional honesty, and that I didn't want it to be secret anymore. I also told them I was afraid of being judged, of being seen as deceptive, of being seen as someone I wasn't. They said something that stayed with me: I don't need you to be simple. I need you to be real. Then they added, but we have to do this responsibly. No hiding. No using it to avoid life. No blaming it for things we don't want to face. That was the first time I heard my own situation described with the language of responsibility instead of shame. It was also the first time I realized that self-acceptance isn't the same as self-indulgence. Accepting myself didn't mean I could stop thinking about consequences. It meant I had to start thinking clearly. Even with a supportive partner, I still struggled. Support doesn't erase years of conditioning. There were days I felt grounded and proud of my honesty. There were days I felt like an imposter in every direction, not a man enough for the world that raised me, not a woman enough to claim anything else, not brave enough to be fully visible, not normal enough to relax. I started noticing how much of my energy went into self-surveillance. I was exhausted by my own mind. That exhaustion eventually became anxiety I couldn't muscle through. It showed up as tightness in my chest, insomnia, irritability, a constant sense that I was about to be found out for something. The strange thing was that I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't cheating. I wasn't harming anyone. I wasn't living a double life in the dramatic sense. But my nervous system didn't care about logic, it cared about perceived threat. And for most of my life, honesty about gender expression had been coded as threat. That's how I ended up in a therapist's office for the first time, not because I had a sudden epiphany, but because I couldn't keep carrying the weight alone. Therapy was not a magic door. It was slow work. It was learning to name feelings without judging them. It was learning that shame is not a moral compass. It's often just a scar. At some point, my therapist suggested I consider hypnotherapy as a complement to what we were doing, not as a way to fixing me, but as a way to soften the automatic fear responses my body had built around certain thoughts. I almost laughed when they said it. Hypnosis, in my mind, belonged to stage shows and movies, swinging pocket watches, people clucking like chickens, control and humiliation. The idea that it could be used carefully, ethically, and gently felt suspicious. I said no at first. Then I said maybe. Then I said yes, but only after researching it, asking questions, and making sure I would be working with someone licensed and reputable. That detail matters to me, because part of being responsible with your identity exploration is being responsible with your mental health care. Vulnerability is real, and not everyone who offers help deserves your trust. When I finally sat in the hypnotherapist's office, nothing happened the way pop culture had trained me to expect. There was no dramatic surrender. There was no loss of control. I remember the chair was comfortable in an ordinary way. The lighting was soft. The practitioner's voice was calm and professional. They explained the process, emphasized consent, and told me I could stop at any point. They said something that immediately reduced my fear: hypnosis doesn't make you do things you don't want to do. It helps you listen to what you already know, without the usual noise. The first session felt like guided focus more than anything mystical. My body relaxed in stages: shoulders, jaw, hands. My mind drifted, but not in a helpless way. It was more like watching my thoughts from a slight distance, the way you can watch clouds without chasing them. The practitioner asked me to imagine a place where I felt safe and honest. Then they asked, very simply, what parts of myself I had been denying. I expected the answer to come out as a neat label, like a word I could finally claim. But what came instead was emotion. Grief, mostly. Grief for the kid I had been, standing in a hallway holding his breath. Grief for the teenager who thought he was immoral for wanting softness. Grief for the young adult who tried to earn love through performance. And under the grief, something quieter, the desire to stop apologizing for existing. At one point the practitioner said, "You don't need control. You need permission. That sentence landed in me with a force I didn't anticipate. Because control had been my strategy for everything: control my voice, control my gestures, control my story, control what people could know about me. Control was how I stayed safe. But control had also been how I stayed trapped. Permission felt different. Permission wasn't someone else commanding me to be a certain way. It wasn't coercion. It wasn't a trick. It was an internal agreement: I am allowed to tell the truth about myself, and I am allowed to do it without cruelty. The most important part of that experience, the part one want to be absolutely clear about, is that hypnosis did not create anything in me. It did not make me submissive. It did not rewrite my values. It didn't turn me into someone I wasn't. What it did was lower the volume of my fear long enough for me to hear my own desire without immediately treating it like evidence of wrongdoing. The desire wasn't even primarily about clothing. It was about emotional surrender in the healthiest sense, the willingness to stop fighting myself. In the weeks after those sessions, I noticed a shift that was subtle but profound. Before, my crossdressing had lived in a mental room marked emergency. It was always urgent, always tense, always attached to the fear of being caught. Afterward, it started to live in a room marked honesty. I could approach it calmly. I could ask myself why I wanted it in that moment. Was I stressed? Was I seeking comfort? Was I trying to avoid something? Was I trying to feel present? The questions didn't shame me. They helped me understand myself. That was the beginning of what I think of as the reflective phase of my life, where I stopped obsessing over what I was and started paying attention to what I needed and what I valued. I learned that identity isn't always a single, clean answer. Sometimes it's an ongoing relationship with yourself. And relationships require communication. I started having harder conversations with my partner, not because they demanded them, but because I finally understood that love can't thrive around secrets. I told them about the hypnotherapy, about the sentence that kept echoing in me: permission, not control. We talked about boundaries and comfort. We talked about what it meant to explore this part of me without making it the center of our entire lives. We talked about practical realities, where it was safe, when it was private, how to handle social situations, what we would do if someone found out, how to speak about it with respect rather than embarrassment. Those talks were not always easy. There were moments of misunderstanding, moments where my partner worried about what it meant for our future. There were moments where I worried I was asking too much of them emotionally. We had to learn that reassurance cannot replace clarity. We needed to be specific. We needed to be honest when we felt scared. We needed to avoid making promises we couldn't keep, like, "This will never change," or "This will never matter," because those are the kinds of promises people make when they're trying to manage anxiety rather than face reality. In that process, I realized something else: my fear had made me self-centered in ways I didn't like to admit. When you're busy hiding, you spend a lot of time thinking about yourself, how you appear, what people might think, what could go wrong. It feels like survival, but it can also make you less present for other people. Part of growing up, for me, was learning to be honest without making my identity everyone else's burden. I also had to face my family. That was a slower decision. I didn't want to treat coming out as a moral performance, like bravery points. I also didn't want to keep lying by omission forever. I had to ask myself what I owed them and what I owed myself. I had to accept that there was no perfect timing, only a decision about what kind of life I wanted to live. When I finally spoke to my mother, I didn't start with labels. I started with feelings. I told her I had been carrying something private for a long time and that it wasn't about rebellion or disrespect. I told her I sometimes expressed myself in a feminine way, and that it helped me feel calm and honest, and that I had spent years being ashamed of it. I told her I wasn't asking her to understand everything immediately, but I was asking her not to treat me like I was broken. She went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels like abandonment, but the kind of quiet that feels like someone sorting through their own assumptions. She asked, "Are you safe?" I said yes. She asked, "Are you happy?" I said I was learning to be. Then she said something that made me cry harder than I expected: "I wish you hadn't been afraid to tell me." That wasn't a perfect moment. It didn't erase the years. She still had questions, and some of them were awkward. She worried about how people would treat me. She worried about whether I would be hurt. She worried about whether she had done something wrong as a parent. I told her the truth, this wasn't her fault, and it wasn't my fault either. It was just a part of me that needed care instead of fear. My father was harder. With him, I couldn't rely on emotional language to open the door, because he had spent his life avoiding emotional language. I tried anyway. The conversation did not go smoothly. He asked if this meant I was confused. He asked if someone had influenced me. He asked if it was a phase. The questions weren't malicious so much as defensive. They came from a worldview where gender rules were the foundation of order. I told him something I had practiced in therapy, a sentence designed to be both honest and non-combative. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to respect me. He didn't respond with a sudden embrace. He responded with silence, and then with a few stiff comments about keeping things private. It hurt, but it was also real. Adults don't always get the parents they needed, and part of maturity is grieving that without becoming bitter. Over time, his resistance softened, not into celebration, but into something like uneasy acceptance. He learned, slowly, that I was still me. I still showed up. I still worked. I still cared for my family. I still took responsibility for my choices. The world didn't collapse because I was more honest. If anything, I became steadier, because I wasn't spending so much energy on hiding. That steadiness is what I think of as acceptance, not the social media version where you post a triumphant announcement and suddenly everything is easy, but the quiet version where you stop negotiating with your own existence. I stopped asking myself to prove I deserved to be here. I stopped treating my gentleness as suspicious. I began to understand that the part of me drawn to feminization, the softness, the surrender, the emotional honesty, was not a corruption of my character. It was a correction. It was the part of me that wanted to live without armor all the time. And I want to say something important for anyone listening who is sorting through similar feelings. There is a difference between exploration and escape. Exploration is when you learn about yourself and bring that knowledge back into your life with responsibility. Escape is when you use any identity practice, whether it's gender expression, work, relationships, substances, anything, to avoid the hard work of living. For me, feminization became healthier when I stopped using it as a secret relief valve and started using it as a form of honest self-care. That meant I had to keep showing up to my responsibilities. I had to keep being accountable. I had to make sure my choices didn't harm the people who trusted me. I also had to rebuild my self-respect. Shame is corrosive because it convinces you that you don't deserve boundaries. When I was younger, I thought my crossdressing meant I had to accept whatever treatment people gave me, as if I had forfeited the right to dignity. That's one of the most dangerous lies shame tells. In reality, exploring your identity should make your respect for yourself stronger, not weaker. It should make you more careful about who you trust, more honest about what you can handle, more committed to consent and kindness. As I moved into the integration phase of my life, the question stopped being "what am I?" and became "how do I live well?" I learned that identity is not just an internal truth, it's also a set of choices. How you speak about yourself. How you treat others. How you manage stress. How you repair relationships when you make mistakes. How you balance your needs with the needs of the people you love. Integration, for me, didn't mean I had to make my gender expression public all the time. It didn't mean I had to become a symbol. It meant I stopped seeing my private self as a shameful secret and started seeing it as a legitimate part of my emotional ecology. Some days I dressed in a traditionally masculine way and felt completely fine. Other days I needed softness, and I allowed myself that without turning it into a crisis. The difference was not the clothes, it was the absence of self-hatred. I also began to notice how many people are carrying private struggles that have nothing to do with gender. People hide depression behind jokes. People hide grief behind productivity. People hide loneliness behind anger. When I learned to treat my own hidden self with compassion, I became better at extending compassion outward. Not in a naive way that ignores boundaries, but in a grounded way that recognizes how much suffering comes from being afraid of who you are. There were consequences, of course. Some friendships cooled when I became more honest, not because anyone attacked me outright, but because some people prefer the version of you that fits easily into their worldview. A few relatives became cautious around me, as if honesty were contagious. I had to accept that I couldn't control other people's comfort. I could only control my integrity. And integrity, I learned, is not loud. It's consistent. Work was another area where I had to be careful. The adult world still contains prejudice, and I didn't want to be reckless with my livelihood. I didn't owe my coworkers intimate details of my life. Privacy is not the same as shame. I made decisions based on safety, context, and necessity. The more I respected myself, the more I could make those decisions without feeling like a coward. I could say, "This is mine," and mean it in a healthy way. I also kept learning about hypnosis, because I didn't want to let a single tool become a myth. Hypnosis, in the way I experienced it, was not mind control. It was not a magic spell. It was a structured way of focusing attention and easing fear responses, guided by someone trained to prioritize consent and safety. The phrase that continued to guide me was the one I began with: permission, not control. Hypnosis didn't hand me a new identity. It helped me stop treating my existing feelings as enemies. It helped me practice surrender, not as humiliation, but as relief. Emotional surrender, for me, meant letting go of the desperate need to be rigid and letting myself be human. That distinction matters because people often misunderstand what it means to be submissive, in an emotional sense. There is a version of submission that is unhealthy, giving up your agency, allowing someone else to define you, tolerating disrespect. That is not what I'm talking about. The surrender I mean is the surrender of denial. The surrender of constant self-policing. The surrender of fear-based control. It is an act of honesty. It is an act of saying, "I'm done fighting my own heart." If you're someone who has never felt this conflict, it might sound abstract. But imagine living your whole life with a muscle tensed. Imagine your mind constantly scanning for danger, not because the world is always dangerous, but because you were trained to believe your authenticity is a threat. Then imagine, for the first time, that muscle loosening. Not because you've been forced, but because you've finally allowed yourself to rest. That's what permission felt like. I don't tell this story because I think everyone should do what I did. I tell it because I think many people are haunted by the idea that their deepest feelings are unacceptable. And when you believe that, you become vulnerable to extremes. Either you suppress yourself until you break, or you swing into impulsive secrecy and risk hurting yourself and others. The middle path is harder, quieter, and more sustainable. It's the path of self-awareness, ethical choices, and gradual integration. If there's a lesson I wish someone had given me when I was younger, it's this: you can take yourself seriously without turning yourself into a crisis. You can explore identity without disrespecting anyone. You can seek softness without abandoning responsibility. You can ask for help without surrendering your agency. And you can be complicated and still be worthy of love. These days, when I look back on the child in the hallway, I don't feel embarrassment. I feel tenderness. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was trying to understand himself in a world that didn't offer him a safe vocabulary. He was trying to find a place inside his own body where he could breathe. If I could speak to him now, I wouldn't give him a label. I would give him permission. I would tell him that curiosity is not a crime, that gentleness is not weakness, that secrecy is a heavy price to pay for belonging, and that he deserves a life where he doesn't have to apologize for his own inner truth. I'm still learning. Integration isn't a finish line, it's a practice. It's checking in with myself when I'm stressed. It's making sure my choices come from honesty rather than avoidance. It's staying connected to the people I love, letting them see me in ways I used to fear. It's respecting the fact that everyone's journey looks different and that no one owes the world an explanation for their private self, but everyone owes themselves the chance to live without cruelty. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.